Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name's Corinne Schuster-Wallace, and I am the co-chair of the Working Group on Climate Change and Health for the Canadian Coalition for Global Health Research, who are hosting this webinar. I'm so pleased you're able to make it to join us for this talk today. And I would ask that you keep your mics muted as long as you're not speaking. We will have the presentation and then we'll open for questions, and you're welcome to put questions in the chat box as well, or you can raise your hand and we can open the mics from there. And I just want to provide a very quick introduction. I don't want you to hear a lot from me. You're here for the Floodplains Climate Change and Health, a Way of Life for the Lozi People of Zambia webinar. And we have Douglas, who is a medical officer for the Limulungu District Health Office in Western Province in Zambia. I'm not going to say any more about his academic qualifications or history, except that he's a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo. I've known Douglas now for almost 5 years. He's one of those amazing and passionate individuals who is really driven to make a difference in people's lives. And it's a pleasure to be able to hear the stories that he's going to be sharing with us today about the Lozi people. But before Douglas provides us with his presentation, I'd like Vic Neufeld, who is an associate fellow in the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria, to just provide a little bit of context, because Douglas's work is part of a larger initiative, the Zambezi Eco Health Program, which he is the brains behind, so to speak. So Vic, over to you, and then Douglas, welcome, and we look forward to your talk.
Good morning, everybody. I'm reminded of, I listened to the WHO briefings on COVID, and Dr. Tedros, when he starts, he'll say, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. So I think this is probably good morning and good afternoon. Very briefly, the coalition's been active with partnerships in Zambia for probably 10 years or more. At one point, we helped to create what's now the CIHR of Zambia, the National Health Research Authority. And over the last 3 to 4 years, maybe longer actually, our group has had a special interest in the Western Province, through which the Zambezi River flows right down the middle and produces a huge floodplain once a year under normal circumstances, at least, that you'll hear about shortly. So we created this partnership, as Corinne said, the Zambezi Eco Health Partnership. It's a partnership that involves the Ministry of Health through the Western Province Health Office, a small university called the University of Barotseland. I see Sean on the list. He knows this place very well. And the coalition as an umbrella for several universities, Waterloo, Saskatchewan, Victoria, Toronto, and so on. And more recently, the University of Lincoln in the UK, where a colleague, Professor Chris Thomas, is now living and working. So the goal of this partnership is to serve as a knowledge platform for the Western Province, 1 million people, on health-related issues, particularly driven by climate change. Through that time, we've worked very closely with Douglas. In addition to the credentials that you see on the screen, I can tell you that he's an expert at driving a Jeep out of deep sand. I've watched him do that a few times. So I think that's enough for me. Douglas, please carry on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think I would like to welcome everyone to this presentation. I think let me quickly just share my screen. Okay. Okay, I think we are good to go. Okay. My short talk is about the floodplains and the way of life for the people on the Zambezi floodplain, which is mostly located in Western Zambia, but has significant portions of land in the neighboring countries. So my presentation really will focus on the Lozi people and how their lives are linked to the floodplain, and probably cite a few interesting points that can apply to research opportunities. The Lozi people occupy most of Western Zambia, here on the map of Africa. And an enlargement of that map, we see the floodplain right in the middle of the Western province. With the studies that Vic hinted to with Chris Thomas, actually the extent of the floodplain is much bigger than this, because the satellite imagery really needed to be corrected. The floodplain is much bigger. So an extrapolation of the floodplain just shows various towns that are located at the edge of the floodplain. But I would also want to highlight that there's a gauge station just at the headwaters for the floodplain on the Zambezi River at Chavuma Gauge Station. And we also look at the gauge station at Matongo, which is about 20 kilometers, some 7 kilometers away from Mongu. This is a map of the Barose land, which is means the land of the Lozi people, which originally occupied most of Western Zambia and part of the Katanga province on the Congo DR, and part of Angola, also includes Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. So the boundary actually of the land of the Lozi people is actually formed by the watershed of the Zambezi River, which runs to the western side, and the Kafue River, which runs to the eastern side, and that is the watershed. So we would say that the Barose land was really bound by the watershed of the Zambezi and Kafue River basins. The town I hinted to, which has the gauge station for the Zambezi River, this is, I got this information from the Zambezi River Authority some 2 weeks ago when I started, but the numbers have since changed because they're added on a daily basis. The peak flow at the Chavuma gauge station was 5,825 cubic meters per second on the Zambezi River. Compared to the same time last year, it was only 695. So there's actually an 8-fold increase in the water flows on the Zambezi River this year compared to last year. This is very important for the people and how they should behave, or they would behave when the flood comes. So the same gauge station shows various water levels. There are some historical water levels, but these really account for the 30-year average, which is shown by the dotted line. But this year, the flood has peaked already twice. And we know that the rain season begins about November, December, but the flood is delayed by almost 2 months for the first peak, which is very unusual for most studies. And it's not only one peak, but there are actually 2 peaks. So as other tributaries of the Zambezi flood, we get the second peak, which is also very important, as I'll highlight later. So we have a second peak already in April, and it is actually going down. Okay. Then the other second gauge station, which I hinted to on Matongo River, particularly I'll look at the peak levels of the flood. The highest that was recorded in the last several years was in 1969, which was 7.5 meters high from the minimum of 1.5 meters. So the difference between the peak level and the minimum level was about 6 meters. That's almost a 2-story building. So when floods come, it's really serious inundation, really, that happens. A difference of 6 meters. At its lowest, it's about 3 meters from the minimum. So this is also shows the significance of this floodplain and the flooding that actually happens. So what do the Lozi people do when it floods? There is a poem which says that the king actually migrates to the higher ground, but it doesn't only do so alone, but even the animals, the domestic animals and the wild animals also migrate. So we have the second biggest wildebeest migration in Africa on the Liwa National Park, which also migrates. So these wildebeest migrate across the border to Angola. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I was hearing some feedback. As a king migrates, he uses this big badge, which is painted black and white. This has significance. And the queen's badge is also painted white and black, but has a crane on top, while the king's has an elephant. All these have their significance, which I'll hint to in a short while. I also just like to play a video which we made with other student colleagues while I pitched a presentation about the climate change on the Barroso Plain.
The floodplains are home to the Lozi people, who have lived there for centuries. They have a unique relationship with the river and flooding. Their perceptions are unlike typical notions of flooding being a hazard as seen in other parts of the world and in literature. To them, flooding is a joyous occasion.
The Zambezi River is at the height of its flood, and rhythmic drumming announces the start of a great celebration. For the Lozi people, this is the most important ceremony in the year. Their Kuamboka. Their lives are intricately tied to the pattern of the rainfall and the cycle of the Zambezi River.
Okay. I would like to acknowledge my colleagues, Saunders, David, and Stuart, and Sarah, that were helping to make the video. I would also want to refer to document on the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, where Barroso land, where the Lozi people live. Actually, there's a PDF there that is quite helpful on the history of the Lozi people. The flooding is really tied to the society and how the Lozi people live. The social life is tied to the flooding cycle. However, the contemporary notions of flooding really are rather different from what the Lozi people have. They embrace flooding and actually follow along with the dictates that the flood indeed offers. In other words, the flood is actually a friend more than it is an enemy, where contemporary views of flooding are that floods should be controlled. While for the Lozi people, floods are actually a friend, and actually floods are allowed to actually have their way, while the people also retreat to the upper lands. Okay, so the Lozi culture really about flooding really has very, very significant, and most of the iconic items or really ceremonies or events in the Western province are actually tied to the flooding. So we can see in the picture, they could not find anything to label their t-shirts. They had to label the names of the badges on the boats of the Komboka ceremony. So flooding is really central to the economy and the aesthetic and the elements of life of the Lozi people. Particularly, I'll cite Namafe in how he illustrates some of the calendar months on the Lozi calendar, how they are linked to flooding. For example, January Sope means that the flood is coming. Yowa means the flood comes. And Kandao, which is May, the flood turns and begins to fall. So we see that if there were changes to the flooding cycle, a lot of these names for the calendar months would actually change. And even the months also associated with certain activities, economic activities, agricultural activities that are also associated with it. Even certain ceremonies, even weddings are planned associated with certain months of the year. June would be Mbuana, which means a flood has fallen. And December would mean that the rains have set in. So all of these are also associated with certain activities, such as fishing or cultivation or gathering indeed, or harvesting the reeds that are on the plain, because housing is made from the reeds and the timber that is available. In terms of governance, the Lozi people have got about 25 ethnic groups, and the earliest known leader of the Lozi people was actually a woman, a lady called Mbuya Wamwambwa. And as they migrated from the Congo and entered the floodplains, they, however, found the Khoikhoi and the Khoisan people, also known as the Bushmen, who were pushed to the southern end of the present day Western province. So Mbuya Wamwamba wanted to have a simple life, so she abdicated and gave the leadership to Mbo Muyunda, her son, to become king. But she still retained the influence and authority over the kingdom. And one of those badges that we saw there is actually dedicated for this queen who has influence, who retains influence over the king. So much as we know that it's a patriarchal lineage, we also know that the women still have influence in the running of the kingdom. So this is somebody was able to write a history of the kings that ruled. So there was no written history about this time, so it's not clear which years they were, but because of these royal burial sites, we know that a particular king was preceded or was followed by a particular king. So, and these have significance because these burial keepers are also the spiritual leaders. When you see a photograph or the ceremony, you will see them dressed in white. and these have significant influence on how the kingdom is run. Let me also just talk about Komboka ceremonies themselves. It was estimated in the 2015 Komboka that about 1.1 million people visited the Komboka at Lialui in a 1 week's period. That means there were more people visiting the province than the people that lived there over a period of 1 week, which is significant in terms of service delivery and so on. But it's not only one Komboka. There were actually several Kombokas, 5 of them, and we see that they are also as grand, but the Mwandi one is no longer held because it never floods. But if we did not have COVID this year, we would probably have had the Mwandi Komboka, because then this place would also be inundated. So, however, we have other Kombokas, the Nalolo, the Livonda. The Nalolo is also quite significant because it is actually run by the Queen of the South, the Litunga of the South. Mboela is South, and it's held usually in April. And the next in line is the one at Livonda by Chieftainess Mbwanjikana. So all these are women, and the last 2 are led by men. So we can see this on the tourism site in Ministry of Tourism. Okay. So there are fears that the identity of the Lozi people will be lost as the climate change starts to set in. The colors on the boat have their significance. The Litunga means keeper of the earth and is symbolized by the black color. And the white color symbolizes flooding. So when the king retreats to the upper land, he retreats and gives the floods to rule over the kingdom. So the black is for the king when he rules, when the waters have receded, and the white is for when the waters rule the land, when the king and his people has retreated to the upper lands. We have the bull elephant on top of the cabin where the Litunga sits. The bull, we know the bull elephant protects the elephant head, but we know that the matriarch is our actual leader of a head of an elephant. So there are also significance attached to the animals that are associated with the ceremony. So this is I was standing right in front of this boat here, and there I am. However, there were over 1 million visitors that were in Mulunga and Lialui. So this is Lialui right on the floodplain when they're about to launch the boat. We also, in the top right corner, we see some of these trophy fish that are caught by tourists may not be there if there's climate change. Okay, I'd also want to play another video about the Barose land.
The Barose floodplain and the Lozi people living there are facing a variety of ecological and nutritional challenges. Food security has long been an issue in the region, with the hunger season lasting from November to January. During the remaining months, however, food remains a concern, with unsustainable fishing practices and food diversity threatening the local community's livelihoods. The Lozi people consume 5 times the amount of fish as the national average of Zambia. In order to meet these demands, aggressive fishing practices are used, which impacts fishing stocks and replenishment.
kibasali matibati bakibana fera babawaye kweta bali blokwakota kubwakwata kemuwaye omu wabana basizana tapimabulo zalisaliyo handi tereka chekule mukamala kuitapiza apa kakuli miyambelo eseliteni kyone za kuli kyone maswe kutuapo kuna ni kuitu sisama wa mosquitoes kwa kushuisa ma mosquito au shu au si kikungera kafanya ni tunchiva tapia ninako yakulizo wale handi.
I was growing up like we just depended on maize in our place. Nothing mostly was done to think about the diets because we believed that what we were cooking and what we were eating was enough for us.
Sometimes when there's too much water, they lose their crop, or like this past season, there wasn't enough rainfall, so some of them lost their crop due to little rain. At the end of the day, everything leads to high levels of malnutrition.
The availability of food is very much seasonal, and with increasing irregularity in the flood's arrival, duration, and intensity as a result of climate change, the impacts may continue to worsen.
Other challenges come from infrastructure for transportation. In the floodplain, infrastructure like roads, bridges, and housing are generally sparse and less developed because of the potential for damage and reduced access that flooding can cause.
According to scientist François Engelbert, who runs the highest resolution climate model of the region, this area is warming at a higher rate than many parts of the world and could see stronger climate impacts. Global climate change is defined as a significant and lasting change in the statistical distribution of weather patterns over periods ranging from decades to millions of years, which may be a change in average weather conditions or the distribution of events around that average. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges humanity is facing. In Zambia, climate change is evident and unpredictable, with irregular rainfall impacting the timing of flooding events and increases in surface temperature.
Based on what locals tell us, based on sort of Douglas's experience and so forth, we know that some years you get heavy floods, some years you don't get heavy floods. But the more kind of regular, consistent processes of regular seasonal flooding have changed. And as this changes, of course, then people adapt to those changes. I think more people staying in the floodplains during the flood season, a variety of other things changing in terms of social practices and so forth.
Okay, there we are. So that was a video with colleagues Sarah Saunders Stewart and Daniel. So really the health challenges on the Western province really come with the visitors when they come for the tourism, and we have seen escalation of lifestyle diseases, HIV, and so on. But it also creates problems in terms of sanitation when you have so many visitors in a very, very short time on a very, very localized area. But also when they leave, they also live with the various health issues that people have, but also they also live their culture as well. So the culture of the people has really over time changed a lot with already what they have. So there are also health problems that are associated with flooding, particularly when the flood is beginning or the flood is ending, particularly water supply issues. But we also have seen that with climate change, we are seeing diseases that are coming in. So the floodplain is drying more, and we see that more of the livestock and animals are actually not migrating. And we had one example of salmonella disease that we had when some water supply was contaminated by pig waste when when the rains were starting. We also have issues with algal blooms, both hypoxic conditions as well as toxic conditions from the toxins that are happening as the more water concentrates when during the dry times. As the floodplain is drying more and more, even the only places that remain vegetated are the riverbeds, and these tend to cause to expose the domestic animals and the wild animals to spores, anthrax spores, and we have occasional outbreaks, which were not experienced in the past because there was enough vegetation and water around to allow for animals to graze at higher levels on the ground, from the ground. And from the study, which Vic hinted to with Chris Thomas, we found that this Anopheles fenestus is no longer the usual suspect for as a vector for malaria, and we are seeing that the interventions that are there may not be working because the usual suspect is no longer the one that we see. So this is the study that we're doing. So they were collecting the larvae and then doing genetic analysis on them, and we see. So this is also a map of the villages around the floodplain, around Mungu area. We can see that the villages are really sparsely distributed, which is also good social isolation in this time of COVID. Of course, there are other issues there now that we can talk about. So there's always good isolation on the floodplain. So really the issues are transportation during the floodplain, because you have the dry areas and you have the areas that are flooded. So you need to have vehicles that can, or vessels that can traverse such kind of issues, which also brings problems for health workers and other service workers, government workers working in the province. I remember pitching that probably we need such kind of vehicles that are friendly to the narratives of the Lozi people in terms of flooding. We are developing indeed these vertical takeoff and landing vehicles for towns, but if they could be developed for the floodplain, that would be really helpful. So we are seeing issues of acculturation. The culture of the people is changing, and because it's changing due to the visitors that are there, globalization, the culture is being lost, and the supportive nature that the environment used to give in terms of flooding cycle really is no longer there. And we also know that people living on wetlands are some of the poorest people, and for them to actually develop, really, it would take a lot of effort, probably from outside. The threat that climate change offers is really a loss of a 500-year tradition and the nation that has been there. It has a very interesting, actually, governance system, which I think can be mirrored to very few governance systems in the world. However, the story of the Lozi people challenges the narratives of floods as being enemies that should be conquered by building things like dikes and so on. But we also know that some wars have been fought over trying to control flood waters. So probably the story of the Lozis, where everybody had to live in harmony with the nature, may be a story that needs to be explored and probably adapted to many of our lives here. So the story of floods as enemies really issues of from other cultures, especially the agrarian capitalists who want to control the waters so that they can have access to the fertile lands. But this style of living also is also antagonistic to development and even economics, where people are allowed the floods to come and inundate the lands and then come back when the floods retreat, and may not be very profitable. So really probably changing the lifestyle of the people and the way they are living may actually be may actually lead to serious social issues, including farming, wildlife depletion, and even depletion of the aquifers that do. I would like to end by probably highlighting possible avenues, like we have conservation authorities in Canada, which can be used to strike parallels that can be used to adapt on the Zambezi upper floodplain. Okay, so the floodplain really can offer as a laboratory for scholarly investigations about flooding and probably pro-government friendship interventions that can be used to adapt to climate change and response, and also probably share some new discourses as opposed to contemporary notions of flooding, that it should be controlled. And that's it, I say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Douglas. Really appreciate it. I'm going to open it up for questions. So if you'd like to put a question in the group chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand. And Douglas, maybe if you stop sharing your screen and you can come back, hopefully full screen.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So does anyone have any questions for Douglas? And in the meantime, I do. If that's okay, I'll take chair's privilege while you're all thinking. Oh, hang on, I see one from Johan. Johanna, please.
No, I was just saying thank you and congratulations. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Well, Douglas, I'm really interested in how the Lozi people are dealing with these social disruptions. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of their fears or their hopes, particularly perhaps not so much going forward, but historically, obviously, as you say, they've lost at least one Kumboku, maybe two historically. And so is there anything in the story and how that's been dealt with and accepted that sort of gives a sense of adaptation and health and well-being moving into the future with climate change?
We've seen some agrarian projects that have begun. So we have, through the government in Zambia, they have put up some fodder projects, some agrarian animal husbandry projects that the people, because most of the people have domestic animals, but to increase production, some fodder projects have begun. There was some fishing ponds, more of kind of commercial fishing ventures that were being put up. They haven't been very successful. Probably, I think they needed to study the the social life of the people. I think it hasn't been accepted very well, especially that they are told that you need to give the fish chance to grow and multiply. And now you are asking them to grow the fish. Some of those are the narratives. How can we start farming fish? For the past several centuries, we have just been harvesting the fish naturally. So it has been interesting, though there are projects going on. Even there's a rice growing project. There was one that was about to start on sugarcane, but they haven't taken place. I guess still the culture is probably the problem. People haven't found ways in which they can harness the culture and actually join. So the people are adapting. In terms of migrating, really they are remaining on the plain, but that is also causing problems. And probably we needed to have a more comprehensive way of actually approaching, probably more of a social approach to actually addressing the issues, because the people have been used to this kind of life, and all of a sudden you are telling them that, ladies and gentlemen, the life has changed and this is the way you need to go, but probably we need to engage them in more different ways.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Jervin, you have to unmute yourself. And then Vic.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. So as a policymaker and weighing the pros and cons or the benefits and negatives of the floodplains, would you recommend that the people of the Lozi people continue to stay on those floodplains?
That's a very interesting question. I wouldn't really, because living has probably got two connotations, maybe even more. Living is like staying on the floodplain and getting your sustenance from the floodplain. You could also live on the upper land, but still get your sustenance on the floodplain. So which one of the two? I think with climate change and with what we have seen so far, living on the floodplain may be dangerous because it can really flood. So I'd rather recommend that people probably live on the upper land and still can have their sustenance or activities that livelihoods still be getting them on the floodplain. However, I feel that what has happened in the past is that people have made up through their desk reviews, come up with projects and so on and implemented them and not really asked the people what they feel really should be done. So I feel with the variable nature that we can have a 8-fold flood this year compared to last year. It would actually be dangerous to allow people to live on the plain continuously. So I think there's no really hard and fast recommendation that I can give. I still feel we need to engage the people and see what is the most amenable solution with the situation that is present.
Thank you, Vic.
Special thanks, Douglas. That was terrific. What do the young people in Western Province think about all this as they see all these changes? Are there any special programs, say at UBL, that helps them think about their own future over the next 10 years, 20 years? I'm sure you have talks with your own kids about this. Can you give us a bit of a perspective about that? Thanks.
Okay. It's very hard for me to say, but my little observations that I've had, at least with the people that I've interacted with, really they feel that the flood is a danger to them, which is very different from the older generation, which feel the flood is actually a friendly thing to bring sustenance, because most of the people now have a kind of adapted a new culture of a new lifestyle, where they actually, most of them now live on the upper lands and actually go and harvest the fish. And when the water recedes, they also plant their crops, and the crops grow by the moisture from the ground. And before the flood sets, they actually harvest their crops. So we see that they're using the plain more for their livelihoods, while they actually live on the upper lands, because we are seeing a situation that 30, 40 years ago, most children had two schools, one on the floodplain and one on the upper land. So when it floods, they would move to the upper land, and they move with their teachers, and they actually school there for 3-4 months. When the signal is given, they go back to the floodplain. That is not happening anymore. So either they are continuously staying on the floodplain, and like this year, a lot of them most likely will need to move, even with all the investments that they made, they will need to move to the upper lands. So we see that there's a change in the culture, that they are living on the upper lands. However, they are getting their sustenance, their rice farms, their maize crops, their cassava fields, also on the higher lands, on the mounds in the floodplain, and continue to rear their animals on the upper lands during the flood season. So we see a change in the culture, but I believe probably it should be more systematic so that it can be sustainable, and probably people can even grow food for other parts for export, for example, from the Western province. So it's still in a flux, but there's a tendency to actually to live on the higher ground.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? Sean.
Thank you so much, Vosingini. I really appreciate it, coming back, quo Rosie, through these images and whatnot. And I did have a question planned, and Dr. Vic's intervention has changed my question a little bit, and I might add a little bit in response to his question. And I can't give a broad brush perspective on how younger people in Western Province or in Zambia in general think of these changes, but I can speak to a few demographics, one of which I'll point out would be young professionals of my age. And I can attest that in that group, there's an awareness of climate change as being a phenomenon and a general disinterest in it. That among the things that people are thinking about, it tends not to be top of mind. And in my peer group, for example, I've been friends with them long enough to see them going from being non-drivers to drivers. And like these types of social mobility are high priorities. Climate change is a low priority. Of the people with whom I do research, some who live very close to the plain, their basic needs at the moment are more important. And when we talk about things like the flood, there doesn't seem to be much of a perspective of the variability of it having changed much more in recent times as compared to in past times. Again, this is just from the people with whom I speak. Now, this ties back to the original question that I had, which is with respect to us at our current moment, where we see that we have unintentionally moved to a low carbon economy, and we will undoubtedly change this in some way in the next little while as we start to move out of the pandemic worldwide. And I'm thinking about the role that I might be able to play as an advocate to see to it that the post-pandemic economy is lower carbon than was the pre-one, thinking about reducing the effects of climate change going forward. Previously, it's been hard for me to justify that I have personal experience with climate change. This presentation has been the best thing that I've ever seen in terms of saying that a place that I know and that I love is experiencing the changes. And Douglas, I was wondering if you could give me some ideas when I'm speaking about the urgent need to decarbonize, the urgent need to be active about climate change, points that I would bring up as to why things are changing in Western Province. Could you maybe, I know that your presentation was a great list, but if I'm in conversation with someone and just identifying a few points, what would you put at the top of that list, especially those points that I would be able to trace back to as proof that things are changing and getting worse?
Yeah, so issue of decarbonizing and things are getting worse. The variability that we are seeing, I think the website that I referred to, the Zambezi River, really is giving you measurements of the flood from of the floodplain. So it will give you measurements for the past 50 years, and then you can actually tell how it has changed. And previously, there were places like I mentioned, there were 5 Kombokas. Now we can only consistently have 3 because the other places cannot. So people who are young probably may not have seen what was happening some 50 years ago. And probably it is something we need first of all to teach the people that what we are experiencing is actually not normal, because that's all they have lived, that's all they have known. Probably the droughts and the low water levels is all they have known. So probably we need to find a way in which to teach people that the effects are actually real and they actually have changed. So people don't have it in living memory. The older generation know that things have changed. So we need to probably get. The issue also is that climate change is really associated with a lot of development and urbanization and emissions, so on. All those things are not there in the Western Province. People have not seen a train before in the Western Province. So they don't know what it means to actually to have all these, what it means emissions are and so on. Of course, they have seen other things. So in other words, the climate issue that is happening is the distal effects of climate change. In other words, the problems are being created in other parts of the world, but the effects are being felt in the Western Province. And that's what we need probably to show, because people may not have the opportunity to learn. So things are getting worse. And I think we have recorded history. The lifestyle of the people is changing. And the sustenance that was already there. If you talk to the local folks, they will tell you that certain animal species that they were seeing are no longer seen. Certain bird species that were there are no longer being seen. And I think I hinted to you some of the health issues we are seeing. For example, the drying riverbeds were not there. This is a new phenomenon which we are seeing. And then now we are having some of these zoonotic or zoophilic diseases that are actually emerging that were not there before. If they were there, they were only just minor, but now they are becoming more frequent in the norm. We also have, especially in agriculture, we have liver flukes in the domestic animals, which were not there, because the animals are now going deeper into the floodplain, into the riverbeds. That's because those will be the only places that have vegetation, and they are picking up all these liver flukes and so on. And then we are seeing that domestic animals that were no longer on the plain, especially the pigs, there were no pigs on the floodplain. domestic pigs or even the wild pigs because of the flooding that used. But now they are there and they are depleting the mollusks, the worms that were there. And that's why the bird species are disappearing, because they are now competing with the domestic animals. And even the more people are now venturing further into the floodplain. So we see that a lot of the antelopes that were on the floodplain, they are now restricted to the periphery of the floodplain, which is not inhabited by humans. So we are seeing a drastic change. Probably we need some ethnographic studies to actually document some of these things, because there's very little what is being documented on the floodplain. Even the people's behavior has also drastically changed. Very, very, very few people, probably the old people, are the ones keeping the tradition going, and the newer generation may not be aware of. So I think that's how I can relate to those issues of are things getting worse. They are indeed getting worse.
Thank you. Is anyone else got a question? I'd like to close out, Douglas, by asking you to reflect and perhaps provide a couple of recommendations on a few threads that have come out of the discussion. You've been talking about an unrepresented group. We know that unrepresented and Indigenous groups and where they live and their dependence on environmental services, they are experiencing much faster rates of climate change in those regions, in many of those regions, and also therefore the impacts. And so what recommendations would you have for researchers, health professionals, policymakers? Because very starkly, you have pointed to local and traditional knowledge. You've pointed to the fact that it's not only deficit, but there are many strength-based perspectives, and particularly looking at floods as friends as opposed to enemies. And again, we often go to the deficit-based experiences of groups of people. And so what recommendations would you have for these policymakers, health professionals, and researchers looking at climate change and health with some of these groups and the Lozi people in particular, in terms of improving the response to the understanding of climate change and health-related impacts?
Yeah, quite a handful. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, in 3 minutes. No.
Yeah. I think as unrepresented people, really, the Lozi people really probably misunderstood, in the sense that their ideas of progress or of living or livelihoods really is not what is contemporary. We feel of like flooding is an issue that needs to be avoided and prevented. We need to build dikes, dams, and so on. Well, for the Lozi people, it's a matter of retreating and allowing the flood waters to do their job and then come back on the land. So if we accept this notion that this is the way of living and livelihoods for these people, we need to now come up with interventions or that are friendly to this notion of flooding. So for the Lozi people, an issue of controlling the floods would probably be unacceptable. And so would need to come up with interventions that allow for such kind of philosophical ideology to actually persist in the people. We also see that when it's flooded, it's very difficult to attend to an emergency, for example. So we need to address also flood-friendly interventions. For example, those vertical takeoff vehicles. Helicopters are very expensive, but I think with these vertical takeoff vehicles, so-called drones, an example would work in this situation and things like that. So I think the first thing is for us to really document the knowledge that these people have and their ideology about life and their connection to the flooding, and then try to adapt interventions to actually exploit some of these ideologies that are already persisting in the population. So I think in a nutshell, I think it's there we need to study probably ethnographic kind of studies really of the people, study the culture, and they see how the new contemporary knowledge of how we can deliver services to these people, and even for them to leverage some of the gathering, the fishing, the agriculture that they have. Lozi fish is some of the tastiest fish I've tasted on. I haven't tasted such kind of fish anywhere else, really. So if we can export it, I think it will benefit both the people and as well as the people eating the fish. So I think some of these things can be taken advantage of.
Looking for the multiple wins. Douglas, you're a winner. Thank you ever so much. Really appreciate it. It's been a fantastic and really, as people have been saying in the comments, excellent presentation and wonderful insight into where you live and the Lozi people and their culture and the intersection between climate change, health, and culture. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Vic, for your background information on the Zambezi EcoHealth Partnership, and wish everybody here, thank you very much for participating. I know that we're being called into virtual meetings left, right, and center. Really appreciate your time and your interest and the questions and comments. Have a great day, stay healthy, and look after yourselves until the next webinar, which will be posted in the next few weeks. Thank you, take care, goodbye.
Thank you, good day.